Good afternoon. I'm sorry to interrupt those of you who are studying, but I'm going to be talking for the next hour. So hi, my name is Brian Herrera, and I am an assistant professor at Princeton University in the theater program there. And what I'll be talking about today is a talk that's titled about the presence and absence of Latinx people in U.S. popular performance and entertainment. Because what I am is I'm a historian of U.S. popular performance and entertainment. When I say I'm a historian of U.S. popular performance, what I mean by that is I look at popular performance not based on industry, not based on film history or theater history or television history, but more the circuit. In some ways, like wherever an actor goes, I probably am interested in that as the realm of popular performance. And so part of what I do as a historian of popular performance is look at the ways in which, if we look at performance as a mode of engaging with culture across industries, we can sometimes see different things than if we look only at television or only at film or only at theater. My area is, so when I introduce myself to other academic types, what I usually say is I am a historian of US popular performance with a specialization between the railroad and the internet. So roughly the later 19th century up until the very late 20th century or into the 21st. And the reason I mark it as being the railroad and the internet is these are two industrial moments where the ways that performance circulated in the United States were transformed drastically by the introduction of this new technology. Within that broad period, what I tend to focus on is how popular performance helps us see and understand changes in race, ethnicity, and sexuality, and how those transformations are both manifested through and reflected within US popular performance. My particular area of expertise is in the history of Latinos, and people who today we would call Latinos, in these entertainment industries. So that's what I do. And what I do is I look at that broad area, broad field, and I look at all these different industries. And I try to figure out what are the Latinos doing, because Latinos are always there and always hidden. Going from the later 19th century into the early 21st century, there's never a moment when people we would today recognize as Latinos are not part of the mainstream American entertainment culture. There's also not a period in which they are central. So this, and often what drew me to the work, in some ways when I developed the book there's copies here today, a book called Latin Numbers, Playing Latino in 20th Century Popular Performance. When I began to develop that book as a dissertation, what I did was I was really particularly drawn to this moment in 1999. It was right when I was really beginning to hunker down and thinking about I was an early career PhD student trying to think about what I would spend the next few years of my life working on. And the summer of 1999, not all of you were there. I know that. Not all of you were there. Some of you might have recollections or might even know the reference I'm about to make. But the summer of 1999 was the summer that everyone was living La Vida Loca. It was the year that Ricky Martin had this big chart-topping hit. It was also a year that within weeks of each other, Time, Newsweek, and New York Magazine, as well as the Washington Post, all issued cover stories on their magazines saying, is this the year that Latinos are going to transform? Like it was this big Latin explosion. Now in 1999, I was just old enough to remember that Latinos had exploded a few times in my life already. And so I began to think as a historian, like, why is it that Latinos keep exploding, and why is it that every time Latinos explode, it's always like, Latinos are new, they're about to be important, they're just got here, oh my goodness, like, did you know that people buy more salsa than they buy ketchup? You know, all these shocked revelations and discoveries about how new and how important and how transformative, either in a cultural way or a religious way or an electoral way, that the Latino presence in the United States was somehow to transform American culture and life. Of course, in every one of these articles I saw that summer, and then as I've studied the phenomenon since, it pretty much is a routine part of the boilerplate template for this. Every time you'd see an article about Latinos just got here, can you imagine? It's going to be big, it's going to be different. There's a sidebar or a second story that goes, here are Latinos throughout the entire 20th century. And they go through a name check, and there's like Carmen Miranda, and then there's Ricardo Montalban, and like they sort of chart that there's this parallel history of presence in the midst of their same narrative of absence or new arrival. And I became interested in this parallel of this way that that the celebrated presence of Latinos in US popular culture often helped to sort of anchor a presumption of absence or lack of presence. That by celebrating, oh, they're here, suggested that they hadn't been before or they wouldn't always be here. Likewise, I was fascinated by this cycle of fascination. This cycle of the fascination of Latino, and in some ways, and as I looked at it and began to trace back Latin explosions, as I called them, Latin explosions going back, there was one roughly every 8 to 12 years. And when I all the way back to say, I didn't really go much further back than the 1890s. But every 8 to 12 years, there was some moment that was typically fueled by a degree of uncertainty, anxiety, sometimes driven by electoral concerns, sometimes racial concerns, sometimes national security concerns, various different things that you could sort of see, oh, 1999, what's about to happen in 2000? Oh, the census. It was the big question, was this the year that Latinos were going to overtake as the largest minority? Like you could just see sort of like, oh yeah, in 2012, it was a big electoral moment. You know, like is this the moment that Latinos are going to be a voting bloc in a different way and have a major so you could see in some ways that these different cycles sometimes would connect other demographic concerns. But I also saw that each of these moments of explosion, what I call in the book Latin numbers, each of these moments of fascinated discovery existed in a way so that it could, so like as I say in the book, it's like each one comes like a thrilling and attention-grabbing pop and a momentary fascination of explosion like fireworks. Each one works like fireworks, like this pop, oh, and then it goes away. And that each one of these moments of discovery, in some ways, was a rehearsal for erasure. And so this cycle, and as a performance historian, I began to realize that this cycle was in some ways a performance script that the media participated in, and often entertainers themselves did, sort of saying, oh, I've got my opportunity now, we're relevant, and you could see it in the language. We can see it often in the language of grant applications or promotional flyers saying, Latinos are about to be the biggest, or like using that rhetoric of Latinos are about to matter, are about to be important. That's the language of the Latin explosion. But part of what I wanted to do as an early career historian in 1999 was to create a space on the library shelf where we could go back and see, we could go back and see like, oh, this is the longer history of the Latin explosion. My original fantasies when I wrote the book were that it was going to be a sort of, like my original proposal for the book, the dissertation, was 9 chapters, starting in 1898 and going all the way to 1999. 3 sections, and each section having sort of an episode. Like there was a chapter proposed, like from Desi to Fidel, the Cuban romance sours. You know, like each one had a topic. You know, and only a handful of those chapters survived in the dissertation, let alone the book. But in some ways, as I look back on that, sort of it was a combination of greediness and cluelessness on my part that I imagined this book so big. But in some ways, that's the work I had to do in order to, I had to wrap my brain around what happened with Latinos in the 20th century, and in particular, what happened with Latinos with regard to ethno-racial legibility. Because at the beginning of this period, the beginning of the 20th century, Latinos, when race was talked about in the United States, Latinos were grouped as nationals. So you would see these things about immigration, going through Ellis Island or whatever, all these race panics of race suicide and white nationalism that was coming up in the early 20th century, and they would talk about these hordes of immigrants coming from all these other places. And Mexicans and Cubans and Puerto Ricans were listed alongside Celts and Jews and Poles and Italians as among the many nations flooding the United States. Somehow, of course, across the course of the 20th century, the Celts and the Poles and the Italians and the Jews somehow entered, however provisionally, into the category of whiteness. The groups that were exempted from the category of whiteness were the groups that we ended up inhabiting the emerging category in the in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the emerging category of Hispanic or Latino, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans. And so I was fascinated by this question of, okay, at the beginning of the 20th century, in some ways we could say, at the beginning of the 20th century, Latinos didn't exist, because the aggregate ethno-racial idea of Latinidad was still gestational, and it didn't, but by the end of the 20th century, it was fairly locked in place. And it was locked in place as somehow other than white, but not exactly black, not exactly native, not exactly Asian. So somehow this provisional ethnic and racial category that was outside of the ethnic and racial categories that existed at the beginning of the 20th century. And part of what I was interested in the book was saying how popular performance was in dialogue with this process of what academics might call racial formation. How popular performance would document that and chart it. And what I came to find was popular performance was often part of the process. Not as we often think of with popular culture, not reflecting the changes, but often rehearsing the changes. What we would often see when I looked at the archive of the presence of Latinos and Latino characters and Latino actors in mainstream film, television, and theater, what I saw was that often we would see these stories that it wasn't quite clear whether or not they had decided that Latinos were non-white, like these film narratives. And then there's other moments where Latino actors were playing black people and playing Asian people and playing Asian, like native people, you know, lots of yellow face and red face and black face. Like, so why Latinos? Why was and then the question that really I knew I had to answer was, why were there more Latinos nominated for Academy Awards between 1947 and 1963 than any period before or since? We do not think of the 1950s as the golden age of opportunity for Latino actors. And yet when we look at the weird archive of the Academy Awards, we see that there's Jose Ferrer, Anthony Quinn, Rita Moreno, Katie Jurado, Susan Kohner, all of whom are openly, as I like to say, they're openly Latino. Like, they make no secret about it. They talk about it in media, they talk about speaking Spanish at home, they talk about their relationships to ethnic communities in the United States as well as home communities. So they're not closeted Latinos. And some of them even have like names like Jose Ferrer. You know, it's not a secret. Rita Moreno, you know, this is not closeted. And yet it's also a little bit uncertain about where they fit. And of course, in the moment that we often think in popular culture and performance history, we think in the middle 1960s, at the moment El Teatro Campesino is founded, Puerto Rican Traveling Theater is founded, the beginning of an independent Latino arts movement begins right at the same time as the opportunities for Latinos in cinema close down. So there's these paradoxes that I was very interested in exploring. And so that's what I developed, was in developing this book, I studied broadly and studied widely in the long history of Latinos in the 20th century in the industries that we would call popular entertainment or performance. And what I did was got a lot of random factoids, because I ended up researching that whole original book proposal from early 1800s up until the 21st century, even though I didn't write that book. And so what I'd like to do today, now that you know sort of, so I'm not like exactly a walking encyclopedia, but I've got a lot of random information in my head. And so part of what I'd like to do is stage the rest of this event as a conversation, and to let you guide what I talk about from here on out. It's sort of a choose your own adventure version of an academic talk, where you get to ask me a question, perhaps something you've always wondered about, or if you'd like to get my hook on, something about, and this could be you get to tell me what I talk about, and it's up to me to figure out how the expertise I've accumulated in building this book and other work I've done, how it might help. I can't promise I'll have an answer to your question, but I suspect I'll be able to have a way to think through your question together. And so that's what I'd like to invite your participation at this point, is if you have anything, burning questions you've always wondered about, or if you want to hear what I have to say about this or that or the other thing, hit me up. Let me hear it. Yes?
I'm thinking about something you said once about like Benjamin and the sort of detritus of history, right? And these things that seem really obscure, but actually when you interrogate them have a lot of cultural significance. And I'm wondering, in your research process, like what were the things that you stumbled upon that seemed the most like relegated to that category, you know?
Well, I think pretty much my whole archive. One of the things that when I talk about, when I go to an archive, let's see how to talk about this. One of the things I found very specifically, and I'm a firm believer in, I'll tell you the story of Juano Hernandez. Juano Hernandez is an actor I write about in the book. He is a legendary cinematic presence when you study African American film. He is Puerto Rican, raised between Puerto Rico and Brazil. His life story, which has never been fully written, which I was able to piece together, he covers, he was born at the very end of the 19th century and died in the early 1970s, and his life chart, he worked with Oscar Michaud. He appeared in the original company of Shuffle Along. He appeared in the original Broadway company of Showboat. He also he also was the first director of the drama department at the University of San Juan. During the war, he taught himself how to read and how to speak English without an accent by memorizing Shakespeare. He worked as a boxer. He worked as a circus performer. He worked in all these different areas, but he never stayed put in any of them. He left his biggest, most visible imprint as one of the early pioneering presences in sort of a respectable depiction of African American nobility. In the 1950s and early 1960s, he played a lot of stalwart and stolid African American men who, in this breakout film performance, it's called Intruder in the Dust, he plays a African American landowner in the South who is unjustly accused of violence so that his land can be taken away from him. And so he holds this really incredible presence on film, this really confident presence, and so he ends up playing these really interesting characters throughout, but always, and he only plays Latino once or twice. On radio, he plays Asian a lot, he plays all kinds of different things, because he had worked in so many different media that even though the historians of African American film had charted his presence during in some ways, the last 20 years of his career, what they didn't see was the fact that none of those accounts talked about him founding the school in Puerto Rico. None of them talked about him starting an acting conservatory on Sunset Boulevard, which, to my knowledge, is the first. To my knowledge, is one of the, if not the first, acting conservatories established in the United States to be premised upon bilingual actor training. He also toured offering one-man performances of Othello, offered in English, Spanish, or Harlemese, depending on the audience. He is the kind of person that his entire career in some ways fell between the cracks because he didn't stay in one industry. And what I came to understand through Juano Hernandez is most minority actors working in the early parts of the 20th century did not lock themselves into one industry. And so the industry models of understanding the significance of somebody's presence doesn't understand the breadth of somebody's work when, like, when a minority actor, somebody who, since he was 15 years old, paid pretty much every bill by being a performer, but he did so in the boxing ring, in the circus ring, on the musical stage, in independent cinema, in radio, in education. He moved laterally in all kinds of ways, and as he did, his stories, they fell between the cracks. He was the first. He stepped out of the legendary Orson Welles production that was widely called the Voodoo Macbeth, this sort of 1930s adaptation of Macbeth that was set in Haiti. He was set to play the lead. He stepped out because he had the opportunity to take on a radio role as a radio serial about John Brown, the first radio serial to have an African American character as its protagonist. So there's remarkable stories about Juano Hernandez and also I think part of it is that one of the things is he's Afro-Latino. So he confounds and complicates some of the ideas about what Latinidad and Hispanic looks like as that category comes into formation. And so part of what I came to understand about the detritus and about the scraps was just because the scraps weren't necessarily immediately significant in a register that was obvious to me, didn't mean I had to sort of be a research hoarder. I had to gather them and to really tune into my spidey sense in terms of like, there's something interesting here even though I don't know what that is. and then trying to piece together the puzzle down the road to see how it fit in the broader portrait. Because that's in some ways the history of popular performance when you're dealing with marginalized communities before the 1960s. You're getting folks who are moving between industries. You're not getting folks who are able to lock into a successful career in one industry. And most of what we do when we study the history of popular performance, historians are trained to look at theater, to look at film, to look at television or radio. They're not trained to follow the actor wherever the actor might go. And if you're looking at minority performers, especially Latino, Asian, or Native American, or if you're looking at queer performers, or if you're looking at women who are defying expectations of what women are supposed to do, very often those are the figures that are not going to be singularly successful in an established industry. And so part of what we have to do is use the example of contemporary performers that are, in some ways, have to be more entrepreneurial because of the way that the industry is set up right now. There's no way a performer really can make their living in one industry anymore. Performers have to move across. But for a good part of the 20th century, the industries were very rigid in their separation. TV actors did not work on film actors did not work in theater, et cetera, et cetera. And the disciplines that rose to study those crafts were similarly siloed. And part of what we as interdisciplinary students in performance studies and American studies and ethnic studies, part of what we have is the tools to sort of move between these different media modalities and to listen for, like, what is the story that might be found, and what might this scrap of information, this failed production, what might it be, what broader story might it tell? Sure, it didn't run very long, but oh wow, Juano Hernandez was directed by Jose Ferrer in this adaptation of a lynching story opposite Mel Ferrer, who was playing a light-skinned black man at the time. So it's like, okay, it didn't go very well, wasn't very successful, but there's this interesting consolation that was on Broadway, with these Latinos and black people collaborating in a progressive narrative about lynching in 1940s. And so it's like, okay, so we can't use the external measures of significance. We in some ways have to go see if there's internal measures of significance that might help us think beyond it having been tossed to the scrap heap of history. One of the things I often do say in my fascination with the detritus is there's a vast middle in popular performance throughout every era of performance history of works that do not become important. Actors who are seriously working actors for years and years and years, but are never award earners, are never celebrated, don't become iconic. And so part of what I believe very firmly is it's worth looking at what I sometimes jokingly call the ever-widening midsection of American popular entertainment to see what are the stories there, because if we stick to sort of very easily embrace stories of significance, whether that be from political or industrial significance, sometimes we miss sort of the laboring history of performers as workers, and as cultural workers in particular, and as strivers, and as people who are deeply engaged in their communities in ways that traditional measures of significance tend not to be as concerned with. So that's a roundabout way, but for me, I always go to the detritus. Often when I pull up a collection, when I go to the archives, I pull out the ephemera box first. Because often the stuff that some archivist goes, I'm not sure what this is or why this matters, but I'm gonna keep it. It often ends up in the box called ephemera. So it's often from the sideways and from the edges that I find my way to the story. And I think that in certain areas, both when you're dealing with the history of marginalized communities, but also when you're dealing with the histories of the popular, sometimes it's the ephemera that gets dismissed first. And so part of what I'm interested in is seeing what are the stories that we have yet to tell if we just reorient our perspective on what significance and what sources might be. Thanks. Other questions? Yes, hi.
Hi. I'm a filmmaker, and I work with Latino filmmakers as well, and we've been thinking about the moment right now.
Yeah.
And of how to become present and how to contribute, right, to Latino narratives that aren't out there.
Yeah.
So I was curious listening to this. I'm new to your book. I haven't read it yet. I'm very excited to. You say there was a trend between the 50s and 70s where Latinos were being recognized. Rita Moreno won Best Supporting Actress,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And that still has not been followed out today. But then there was also a rise in the 90s with American Me and Higher Learning. La Bamba, and then Selena a little at the end. And then there's another lull. And then we had another pickup from Mexican filmmakers becoming popular here in the United States. Do you see a through line in the connection of societal shift, or what are sort of the connecting factors that cause those swells and the dips?
Well, the swells and dips come from a variety of different reasons, but what I think the swells and dips do confirm is the most consistent thing I can say is the cycle. The windows of opportunity is the lesson for art makers to hold on to, because there are moments where the deciders, for example, might be more willing to greenlight a project. Often in these moments of Latin explosion that I'm often so critical of, those are the moments when the exhibitions get scheduled. Those are the moments when somebody gets a development deal. Those are the moments when this film gets greenlit. These moments of opportunity, and so sometimes the film itself might come a few years later, but there's these moments of opportunity that sometimes are triggered by politics, sometimes triggered by, but they're often triggered by this ongoing problem of the US entertainment industry not knowing how to take seriously, or not knowing what to do with Latinos as entertainment consumers. In terms of, since the 70s, there's been this awareness of the power of the Latino entertainment dollar, but there's often been a kind of naivete to racist cluelessness about how to address that dollar, and so that's in the commercial entertainment industry, that's what drives decisions, On the not-for-profit side, where you might get development grants from foundations or institutions, or sort of on the theater side where you might get commissions or get readings, there's a different rhetoric of inclusion and of the priority of diversity, which isn't always driven by the sense of dollars, though it is often funded by initiatives for audience outreach. So there's this weird dynamic where Latino performing arts makers in particular, especially those dealing with narrative like film and theater, there's always this question of a potential audience and how can that audience be delivered. And so most filmmakers and theater makers often find themselves in this odd tension of like, okay, I want to make work for my community, but about my community or about my own experience or just the work I want to do. But in order for you to greenlight me, I have to deliver my community to you as an organization that hasn't really demonstrated a reciprocal commitment to that community. So there's this constant balance. And what I think is key in that is that these windows of opportunities do open in moments. So when there is, and I think the best thing to be alert to is like, are we in a moment where the diversity calls are in with where there's a new diversity fellowship for content writers for streaming TV who are addressing women of color, And if there is, then you can suck your teeth, but go try to get that money, right? But then, because these are the windows of opportunity where work can manifest and where work can be built. But it's what I am firmly convinced on, increasingly convinced about, is in nowhere in the for-profit or the not-for-profit sector has there been a sustained investment in the development of Latino potential. There's been an acquisitive investment in Latino product that comes and goes, but there hasn't been a sustained investment in Latino creative potential. And so that's where what I see among playwrights and filmmakers and artists and actors and musicians is often creating a community that is independent of the industry itself, that's within the industry but is not defined by the industry, and creating networks of support and sustenance that sort of are part of the industry but also apart from the industry. For example, the founding of the Latino Theater Commons in 2013 is an exemplary model of this, where a group of theater makers decided that it's been too long since US Latino theater makers had gotten in the same room to talk about it. And so they created the space to have a convening in Boston in 2013, where about 80 Latino theater makers got together, and they came from all different segments, from theaters like Steppenwolf and Oregon Shakespeare Festival and New York's Public Theater, but also community-based theater like Casa 0101, El Teatro Campesino, the international festivals in Miami, as well as revitalized companies like Academia in Dallas, and then including academics and teachers, and so this broad array of stakeholders in the future of Latino theater. And instead of it relying upon other mechanisms of value, like that most theater organizations do, like what segment of the market are you in? And so like the culturally specific theaters would often be invited to the same conferences, but they wouldn't be invited to be in the same rooms as the people working at places like the Mark Taper Forum or the New York, And so what the Latino Theater Commons did was it said, we're just all in the same room and let's talk to each other. So it created a lateral structure of mutual recognition and mentorship that has ended up being very sustaining for the long work of transforming internal to the theater. So I think that part of what has become very clear to me about the reality facing contemporary Latino artists is the big bucks often do come from these institutional structures. The jobs, like jobs at universities, jobs at cultural organizations, these kind of things often do come from large apparatuses that are not Latino specific. But the long-term sustenance of Latino arts and community is not being sustained by those entities. The way it's being sustained is by artists supporting each other, lifting each other, building relationships with scholars and critics, and building a network that can sustain folks through the lean times, whether that's a general lean time where nobody's getting work, or where you just have a dip, And so I see artists like because often what happens is you'll be among, like, you'll get a great opportunity, but then you'll be the only Latino there. So you'll finally get the writing job in the TV show, but you're the only Latino in the room. And so how do you sustain beyond that? And usually it's external networks. So part of what it is I think understanding that the cycle of investment is a cycle. And it's typically an acquisitive investment. They're looking to get something from Latino content makers. The developmental investment comes laterally from other artists and from communities. And so part of what Latino artists in particular, it's incumbent of them building both access to both networks. So that if you get an opportunity, you have a network of people that you can bring along in right behind you, or if you're busy and you can't say yes, you have 16 other Latinos that you have on the list that you can say, call them, building that network of advocacy. As Diane Rodriguez, who is a member of El Teatro Campesino, who was the chair of the theater group, worked at CTG for years, she says that I do not walk into any room without making sure the door is left open behind me. And I think that is part of the long-term sustenance of our arts community. We cannot look to the institutional structures for that sustenance, and because it's a tension, and the cycle is there. And I think that we are in a moment where there's an interest in content and a hunger for content. And the question is, we're also at a sort of a crisis point of where's the money coming from and where's it going? There's a boom in content creation, but it's still a deeply uncertain model of where the money, of how sustainable this is. I worry a little bit about a content bubble, about there being this bubble in content, because nobody really knows how anybody's getting paid, and so all it takes is Amazon saying, okay, we're not going to do original programming anymore because we're not making any money, and suddenly a lot of things change. But we don't know, we're in a transition. So there is an opportunity for content creators of all stripes to really say, I'm here, I'm available, and to build the skills that they're necessary in order to be legible to those industrial structures, but also to stay in dynamic collaboration with other groups that will likely keep you going in the leaner years. I don't know if that answers your question, but that is sort of my arts advocate answer based on my historical awareness. So I'm running people off, so I don't know, so yes?
I'll ask a question. So what do you attribute to that moment from the 40s through the 60s in which Latinos were rewarded by the Oscars, and there was sort of a, Desi Arnaz racial invisibility to them? How did that happen?
Well, I think, I offer one answer in the book, but I do think the simple answer is the question of it was a moment of racial uncertainty, right? It was a question, like the period is often viewed as a period of migration. Like immigration is very quiet during that period. There's not a lot of immigration from Europe or from Asia. And so when the history of immigration, when they talk about the history of immigration in mid-century, they talk about it as being a very relatively quiet time in this booming economy with not a lot of new immigrants. But of course, migration within this hemisphere is enormously dynamic. Puerto Ricans are moving to the mainland in greater numbers than ever. There's an incredible degree of fluidity among Mexican American communities, and this is the beginning of the period of the transformation of the US relationship with Cuba and the beginning of exile. So there is an incredible degree of uncertainty about these Spanish speakers that are coming in to these different urban, mostly urban enclaves in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago and Miami. And one of the things I learned from the chapter I read about West Side Story is there was an incredible uncertainty among the New York press about how to talk about Latino migrants, Puerto Rican migrants from the island when they came to New York City. And there was sort of an argument among the tastemakers at places like Atlantic or Harper's or New York Times or the New Yorker about whether they were like immigrants coming through the great door of New York as the portal into the United States, sort of like European immigrants of previous generations, or if they were more like the darker-skinned American citizens from the South who had come up in the Great Migration. The question of were they more like Europeans or were they more like black people? And of course, Puerto Ricans, as they began to populate New York, they defied patterns of migration that there wasn't a single, Puerto Ricans when they came to New York in the 50s, they didn't necessarily go to one neighborhood. They went to the neighborhood where people from their village on the island had gone. So they were in different parts of the city. Spanish Harlem, Lower East Side, the Hell's Kitchen, but they didn't go to one area, which typically had been the pattern for Italians and Jews and others. And so there was a kind of way in which Latinos generally were a little bit unclear where they fit. And that is a big part of, I think, what ends up informing why Latinos not only were honored, but the way they were honored is they had access to good parts. And part of the reason they had access to good parts is because what I see every seriously working Latino actor in this period played European, even if they were Juan Hernandez. They played African American, they played Asian American or Asian, they played Native American or indigenous. So there was a kind of way where Latinos, it was a period where the idea of Latino-ness was both proximate to whiteness, but also alien from whiteness. So that meant these Latino bodies were especially useful in narratives of intercultural encounter, especially erotic narratives of intercultural encounter. And so there was something about the way that Latino bodies were fascinating in this period that also allowed them to, and the question had yet to be settled of whether or not they were non-white. There was an uncertainty, and sort of I think the Desi Arnaz example is a key one, because when that show came to the network, it was coming off of the radio in which the Lucy character was married to a different, sort of an Irish guy. And she said, I'm not going to do the TV show unless we can do it with my husband. She had all kinds of personal reasons why she wanted to be working in the same town at the same time as her husband. And the suits almost said no, and this is one of those other features, the show became so popular that they found ways around his uncertainty, like the anxiety, even though, and at the time it was not considered an interracial relationship. One of the great factoids of one of the figures I look at in some detail is Ricardo Montalban, who is an actor who had a complicated prehistory, had sort of become a rising star in the Mexican cinema, and then was poached by MGM to be hired as their in-house Latin lover. And so he came to work in this country, came to work in the Hollywood, even though he'd been in Los Angeles and working in New York, he came to work in Hollywood in the later 1940s. But it was a period when the studios also made a big part of their bank by renting their actors out, so by loaning people out so they would get income even if they weren't paying. So he ended up being jobbed out to all these B movies that often had him playing Mexican American or Anglo or European American characters. But in the middle 1950s, his contract was dropped by MGM, and he ended up doing a lot of work in theater and beginning to do more work in different kinds of films. And around 1957, he was just wrapping production on what was a major Oscar bait kind of picture called Sayonara, in which he played a kabuki master actor in Yellowface at the same time that and that film was opening at the same time he was appearing on Broadway opposite Lena Horne in the musical Jamaica. Jamaica was marketed as an all-black cast. Ricardo Montalban was the male lead. Ricardo Montalban got some heat for playing a yellow-faced character, but it was not a deal breaker, even though there were Asian Americans in the same film. But he had a relationship with a white woman that somehow was less incendiary than an Asian man having an erotic relationship with a white woman on screen. So there's this way in which the illegibility of Latino, and at this time in his own communications, he talks about himself being Mexican, he talks about himself being Spanish, he talks about himself being of the Southwest, and he also talks about himself as being white. So there's a little, and he also talks about being an advocate for civil rights and about that the correct treatment of Mexicans in Los Angeles. So the fixity of what meant Latino wasn't as much of a problem. 10 or 12 years later, he founded Nosotros, the first advocacy organization in Los Angeles about Latino actors. So it was a period of really forceful transition, of reckoning with what are these Latinos? Will they be entered into the category of whiteness, or will they be exempted? And if they will be exempted, what ends up happening is a new category emerges to hold them. But of course, once Nixon introduces the idea of Hispanic, it becomes almost immediately inadequate to the internal diversity of Latinos, because Hispanic is presumed it's envisioned specifically to address Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and Mexicans as a way, sort of to acknowledge the U.S. colonial relationship to each of those territories. And also Hispanic means of the possessions of Spain, so it prioritizes the European dimension of Latino identity as opposed to thinking more hemispherically. But what we do begin to see in the later 1960s, and then definitely through the 70s and 80s and 90s, is really the formulation of this emergent ethno-racial category of identity and also identification that is both within the racial structure but also separate in its own zone. And I think now they're still reckoning with how, is this a racial category? Like every census, there's a different way of dealing with how to talk about multiraciality, because at the beginning of the 20th century, race was understood in this sort of these fantasies of purity. You went after black blood, you were black. You were either Asian, and thus permanently unassimilable, or not. You were native or not. You were white or not. U.S. citizenship had been presumed about one aspect of raciality made you other than white. Latinos come in and they complicate the premise, the fantasy, and security of white supremacy and white purity. And so in the 1950s, we see this moment where the reality of Latino bodies is uncertain where it lands. And we see popular performance. We see Rita Moreno before West Side Story, where she's playing the Burmese slave Tuptim in The King and I. She's playing the Hollywood starlet in Singing in the Rain. She's playing an Indian exchange student on TV shows like Father Knows Best. And as she plays and as she says, she had the all-purpose ethnic accent where they didn't need it to be specific. She would use one accent for any of these characters. And when she finally got the opportunity to play Anita in West Side Story, it was the first time that she realized that, oh, I can play an ethnic character with a degree of integrity and authenticity. And she did so and didn't work for about 5 or 6 years after her Oscar, because she didn't want to take any of the roles like she had taken before. So it's an interesting question, but I think part of what Latino bodies were especially useful for producers wanting to think about the edges of ethnicity in this period. And once the 1960s come along and there's self-identification coming along around ethnicities, many of the mainstream producers step back and don't work with stories the same way. And it's also the period where, even though it's a boom of Westerns, we see a lot of, re-emergence of red face and brown face in traditional ways. We see Latino actors closeting their ethnicity. In the 1960s is when we really see an uptick in Latino actors changing their names to Anglo-sounding names, even when they've been working under Latino names for years. And so it's really like the folks from that generation, like Chita Rivera, Rita Moreno, Mel Ferrer, they're the ones who came up in an era where there was no pressure to change one's name. Folks just a few years later, like Henry Darrow, Raquel Welch, all of these others, Yvonne Ethon, all of these other folks who end up working seriously for years, end up feeling the pressure in the later 1960s separate themselves from ethnicity. So there's a fixity going on, and it's part of how popular performance rehearses points of clarification. Like, it doesn't reflect the change. It often experiments and rehearses the change, often in the years immediately prior to its arrival. So we often don't see, I say that performance, there's no smoking gun. There's no time when you'll see a performance. It's very rare, I can't say no, but it's very rare that you'll see a performance make change. Like what historians always look at for the performance of causality, where this performance happened and this other event came as a result. Very rarely do you see that. What you do see, though, is performance is especially valuable as a venue to rehearse the possibility and conditions of transformation. So what you'll see is, and this is when you see an old TV show or an old movie, and you look at it and go, this really feels like a movie I could see today, until Mickey Rooney comes along in Yellowface. You know, when you see these weird moments of incongruity, of like, how did it make sense for that to happen? It's a reminder that certain questions hadn't been settled, and sometimes they are our cues. And that's part of what I wanted to look at about this, the remarkable presence of actors we would today recognize as Latino in the 50s, 60s, in the 50s and 60s. And I was trying to make sense of how could I see their casting in all this diversity of roles as a kind of documentation of unsettled questions about Latino ethno-raciality. And so there's an incredible demographic dynamism going on in the period. There's also these performers who are, there's very little independent work, so Latino actors can't like work in a culturally specific theater necessarily, like they're working in the mainstream industry in television or film or radio. And so how they're used ends up I find a very interesting moment, but very, very quickly thereafter, we see a gap in cinema, like where a colleague of mine was asking for, can you point me to compelling representations of Latino lives and characters in the 1970s, in films of the 1970s, and it's really thin. You know, you get these depictions from the sideways, like Cheech and Chong, and you know, you get these sort of, but it's not a period where Hollywood is telling. TV, there's some interesting work being done on TV in the time, when you can think about, like, this is the time when you see like Good Morning Miami, and you see Chico and the Man, and you see like Ricardo Montalban is mostly working on TV in this period, and then there's all these different ways where TV is different, and then theater is beginning to be pretty dynamic. And then by the late 70s and early 1980s, you start getting these theater crossovers, like Raul Julia and Edward James Olmos, crossing over from theater into film and television, and then that ends up being this kind of necessary star presence that helps lifting higher profile projects. But it's a startling gap, and it's it's one of the examples I see as being sort of going back to this acquisitive. Latinos have often been utilized by the mainstream entertainment industries, but they've rarely been invested in as a constituent part of those industries. So if they're coming over from another national cinema, if they're in a community and there's a moment of interest in trying to reach out to broaden the demographics. But it's a fascinating moment of mid-century, and in terms of the ways in which in the 1950s, if we were to go back and get Jose Ferrer and Ricardo Montalban and Desi Arnaz and Juano Hernandez and Mel Ferrer and Anthony Quinn and all of these guys in the same room together and ask them, so what's it like to be Latino working actors? They wouldn't have an answer for that question. They would likely have an answer about what it was like to work around questions of race, or what it was like to work around questions of their heritage. But the idea of being a Latino actor was not an idea that was really in circulation in the 1950s. And it's striking how recent that was.
It's so ironic, too,
yeah,
that in the 50s was kind of more colorblind, and then in the 60s it became more sort of pointed. Like, I think that people of my parents' generation did not consider Lucy and Ricky an interracial couple.
Yep.
But I think in the 60s and 70s, I think people probably considered them an interracial couple.
Well, and that's and celebrated. And I think what's key about this is performance is rife with paradox. Like, most of what I study is a paradox. You know, the paradox of a period in which it's not a great time to be Latino in this country, and yet Latino actors are actually in mainstream film. 1960s, it's a really dynamic time to do independent Latino arts making. terrible time to be trying to work in movies. These paradoxes, and then how do we put these in conversation so that they help tell a story about Latino popular performance more generally, rather than what often will happen when you do a history of Latino popular performance, is you'll talk about movies for a while, then you talk about theater for a while, you talk about TV for a while. And what I'm attempting to do is think about what is the texture when we look and see how what Rita Moreno did when she couldn't get film work, she started doing much more stage work, which led to her doing different kinds of television, led to her doing a play like The Ritz, which got her Tony, which led to, I think that was and then she ended up doing guest appearances on things like, and she did all the public television work like on Electric Company, and that led to her appearing on The Muppet Show. So she became an EGOT of somebody who won an Oscar, Emmy, Grammy, and Tony. She got the Oscar first, and when she couldn't get work in film, she found ways to do work in these other segments that got her the recognition in other segments of the industry. So her being an EGOT as a performer, which is hard as a performer, especially in the rules of those days, she did it because she couldn't get work in film. You know, so it opens up interesting questions when we start thinking about the lateral moves, and we think about these paradoxes not as things to be explained, but as things to be sort of taken for granted as new coordinates of how we understand. Like that paradox of, oh, isn't it an interesting paradox? Is the moment we see the beginning, seeing the booming of Latino-centered work in grassroots communities and even in mainstream organizations like New York Shakespeare Festival and those kind of things. When we begin to see Latino conscious work being developed in this middle 60s, this moment that often in the studies of Latino studies we see as an opening moment of the middle 1960s, it's concurrent with closing in another segment of the entertainment sector. So this is a paradox. What can we learn from that beyond the recursive cycle of racism? One of my favorite lines in the book is I say, I take it for granted that the archive of popular performance is also the archive of popular racism. I think everything that when you're working in mainstream, you're trafficking on the edges of or at the center of sort of often racist ideologies of the moment, which may not be visible to you in the moment you're working with them.
Or at least stereotype.
Well, you're encountering stereotypes, and there may be some things, like Ricardo Montalban taking on Nakamura in Sayonara did not necessarily see that, and taking on a character of African descent in Jamaica did not necessarily see that as being participating in a kind of what we would today call whitewashing.
Work is work.
Yeah, it was, and he saw it as a solidarity. He saw it as an act of solidarity. He said, "I understand what it's like to be marginalized. I understand what it's like to be an immigrant." He had ways in and approached it with a degree of cultural integrity, and he took it very seriously. Sure. But of course, he's also participating in racist representation practices of that era. Sure. And so part of what is important to acknowledge is that we often don't see the water that we swim in, the air that we breathe, and it's a few years later we'll see like, oh wow, that was dang homophobic. Who knew that was, or like, wow, I had no idea that was, I just took for granted this whole transphobic notion. Like, our awareness of the landscape in which we work changes over time. Sure. And part of what I love about popular performance is its chaos. And the fact that most people, when they make a popular performance, they're not doing perfect work. They're often doing crap, and they know it. But in the process, cultural work is going on. They are cultural workers too. And one of the things I took very seriously in building the book was I wanted to take seriously performance makers, or actors, writers, people who made performance, and not see actors as vessels or not see actors as screens upon which ideas were projected, but actors as folks making choices and choosing what roles to take, what not to take, choosing what to say in interviews about them, choosing how like finding ways to be resistant within a stereotyped role, like these kinds of things, and to say like and to really tune into the actors who I felt I saw them working a kind of cultural activism in very limiting, confining environments. And that's where the paradox is a productive site of discovery, because if we look to the archive of popular performance for purity, we're going to be very disappointed and we won't have much to learn from. And we will tend to dismiss our elders because we refuse to take seriously the limitations of the conditions in which they work. And part of what I was looking to do is to create what I still always do is aim to do is look for a way to embrace the fact of the elders' accomplishment in the context in which they could work. Like it's still, I find it, I mean, this is one of the one of the things. I was very proud that I had a Charo paragraph in my book. Like I decided when I wrote this book, I'm going to have a Charo paragraph. I knew for sure, like I said, I don't know what the book's going to do, but there's going to be a paragraph about Charo. I'm a bit angered by the fact that my paragraph about Charo is arguably the only scholarly treatment of Charo. There's glancing references to her, but there's no serious engagement with one of the most ubiquitous presences on 1970s television, and somebody like Dolly Parton, who is very intentional about her deployment of a broad public persona and anchoring that with a very deft capacity as a comedian and as a guitarist. You know, so she's a complicated person who's working exactly within the limitations, and part of the reason why she was on every Love Boat episode and every talk show and all these different things is she had one of the highest what was called Q ratings of the time, like the ways in which public polling folks would go through and would talk to people and say, do you know who this person is? How do you feel about them? And they would come up with this rating that would then circulate among casting professionals saying, and that's how like things like game shows and shows like Fantasy Island and Love Boat, all these anthology shows, how they'd be populated. Because it was if somebody had a high enough Q rating, they would be hired. Not because they were good, but just because the audience would say, oh, I like them, I'll stick around and watch the show. I'll watch Hollywood Squares, I'll watch Match Game, I'll watch Love Boat, I'll watch all these weird, I'll watch this variety show because Charo's going to be on it. You know, this kind of thing. And so I find it, but there's kind of, my generation in particular, had a kind of like a horror fascination, like a mortification relationship with Charo, but it's striking to me that there's still, that we don't necessarily know how to return back to the conditions in which folks worked, and to really look at the fact that they were working and were doing what they were doing. And even though she, you know, we can argue about whether or not she's actually Latina because she's from Spain and all of this, but she was inhabiting the space of Latinidad. And one of the reference points of Latinidad, for better and worse, alongside Eric Estrada as Ponch and Ricardo Montalban as Rourke, like these, and Linda Carter as Wonder Woman, these characters, these actors that every Latino knew were Latino, even though their character names were referenced nothing about their Latino-ness. You know, so there's these paradoxes that I think are often quite generative and often help us evince ways of understanding the complexity of performance making and its ups and downs and its unpredictability in ways that are not always about resistance, not always about progressivism, but often about endurance, survival, and the hard work of getting work in any segment, especially the culture industry. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about gender? And I come to this partly through your discussion of Rita Moreno, like that I can't figure out if she's a unicorn, you know, that she was able to traverse all these different fields and win all these accolades, and yet there's nobody else quite like her. And I'm wondering, as you bring up Charo, is there something about the way female performance can elide certain limitations that male performance cannot?
Well, I think one of the things, I think gender is a really complicated thing for Latino performers because there tends to be an excess of gender for Latino performers, male and female. Part of the reason, like the concluding chapter of my book, I talk about the preponderance in the 1990s of this emerging archetype of in depictions of gay male couplehood in the 1990s. There was an over-reliant, almost every gay male couple in popular performance, theater, film, and television, almost every gay male couple you'll see has one of the partners being Latino. The other partner might be black, the other partner might be white, but there's this sort of reliance on the Latino boyfriend as sort of a way of making legible the sameness and the difference simultaneously, of making a sort of, bringing a kind of hetero, like not heterosexual, but more sort of diversity within the homo, you know, sameness within the difference. And part of what it becomes especially useful for performance makers is the Latino body, male body, will bring with it an excess of masculinity and often an excess of femininity too. So there's a kind of fervor, a passion, a spectacular display, a kind of super machismo, but also a sass, all of these kind of things that are like a kind of a dandyism that can be macho. At the same time, it can also edge to the feminine. So there's a way that the masculine body is, the masculine Latino body edges the femininity and the masculinity, and in the long black legends of the excesses of Spanishness, right? And I think that for women it's similar. You know, I think that when we think of somebody like Katie Jurado, who is perhaps most remembered for her role as Senora in High Noon, but was also Oscar nominated for an Indian character in Broken Lance, and worked in a variety of different ways, mostly playing Latino characters, but also playing Black and Native. She did play Asian too. What she did not have was fluency in English, nor did she have what many of these performers do, which is a capacity to sing and or dance. So when one has the capacity to do comedy and drama, to sing and to dance, to do more, you know, it's in some ways that's what the unicorn feature is they can do a lot, and they're often expected and required to do a lot more. Like Ricardo Montalban was extraordinarily athletic, just by disposition. And so that meant that when he had to be one of the partners opposite Esther Williams, he could swim. When he had to play bullfighters, he learned how to bullfight. When he did kabuki, he did the elaborate physical training for kabuki. It also meant that they took his shirt off a lot. If you see the old episode of Wrath of Khan, he's like, you know, he's naked. And the whole narrative of that show is he's got an unbelievable erotic power over a white woman on board. So there's a kind of way where this excess of masculinity or excess of femininity is always counterbalanced by gendered non-normative behavior. So there's this way in which that, like the performers that when we see the women, because there are women like Dolores Del Rio, Carmen Miranda, you know, the question that in stereotype studies that we talk about the dark lady or the clown, you know, the Spitfire or the dark lady, you know, sort of the woman of incredible majesty and mystery and ominousness, right? Or the one who's sort of like a Lupe Vélez, like just sort of out there and talking really fast, and sort of what we see with Sofia Vergara, you know, this kind of that capacity of the malapropisms, the sort of the hypersexuality, all of these things that Carmen Miranda, Charo, Sofia Vergara, it's all in the same zone of this excess of physicality, this excess of accent, and this capacity to turn jokes, often pivoting upon malapropisms, right? So there's traditions in certain ways. The question is how deftly are performers able to step into and out of those limitations, even as they master them from within. And so for me, I see the gender question at mid-century is actually a precursor to what I'm talking about with the 90s, is it really clarifies the ways that Latinos in the 20th century in particular are often anchored with an excess of both gender performances, and therefore somehow incompetent at either. You know, there's somehow that they're not normatively gendered, and they're excessively gendered in different directions. You know, even Ricky, you know, like, and that's often with the man. It's often in a sense of dandyism, or it's a sense of unrestrained passion, which on the one hand can be incredibly compelling and thrilling, but on the other hand can go into the area of erotic threat or rapaciousness or violence. So this way that every stereotype is double-sided, that's sort of part of how the ways in which Latino performers are often deployed. Performers have to find ways to do what's expected of them and keep their foot on a solid ground of integrity. And not every performer has the capacity to do that. And so that's part of what is, like, there's a beautiful piece by Deb Paredes about Rita Moreno in West Side Story and talking about, it's called Queer for Uncle Sam, I believe, and it really talks about the capacity of a performer to perform resistance in the strictures of confinement of a rigidly scripted role that can easily be read as stereotype. And so part of it is about taking seriously the agency of actors even in the context of their limitations, of the roles that are scripted them. So the ways in which actors peek from behind the mask of stereotype at certain points, or use the stereotype in ways that are unexpected. And I think those, even though I tend not to use the term stereotype very much, because stereotype is a term that we really borrow from mass media and therefore two-dimensional media, whereas performance is often an embodied practice that even if it enters into mass media, there's a moment when it's not fixed and not easily replicated. And so, and then also performance as a global technology is a performance that relies on type. Like world performance history is a history of stock characters and types. And so there's a complicated relationship once we start getting into the 20th century. But what we often see is the performers that audiences are fascinated by are the ones who are not defined by their roles, but who have a complicated relationship, that we love watching somebody become somebody even as we know they're not that person. And with minority performers, that's no less true. Especially the minority performers who build relationships with communities over long term, like that are part of the arts communities, like Rita Moreno and Ricardo Montalban, Anthony Quinn, others who had like I just saw Zoot Suit the other night here in town, and there's this sort of moment when Valdez name checks like Anthony Quinn and Rita Hayworth, the ways in which these folks who are working, like that they were invested in communities, even though their work might not show that. Anthony Quinn started his first film company when actors started doing film companies. His film company in the early 1960s focused on border films. He wanted to work with entertainment on from both sides of the border, and he wanted to do work that was about, in some ways, that didn't make a lot of movies, but that's what it was intentionally about. So it's like we've got these precedents there, and so part of it is about dodging that. But in terms of gender, I ended up focusing on the dudes because I had a good three. But one of the things, originally when I was going to do one of those chapters, I was really going to focus on the women, but I think that the women also deal with the gender, with a different structure, limits of longevity, and of career longevity for all kinds of reasons that we talk about in Hollywood all the time. And so, I found it harder to track change over time in the ways that I did for the guys in the 50s. So even though there are women working, I found the guys were able to maintain longer, a broader archive for me to make my claims. So yeah.
What do you think about Hamilton, the Hamilton craze?
Hamilton, what do I think about Hamilton?
Or what is that rehearsing, what moment?
Well, I think what it's rehearsing is a few things. I wrote 3 articles in 2016, and all of them were about Lin-Manuel Miranda. So I'm basically out of. I don't know what I think at this point because I've spent so much time saying what I think. I do think that what the last 2 or 3 months has helped me understand is arguably Hamilton. I suggest that Hamilton will be a really great guide as an emblematic work of the Obama era. As an era that was incubated in some ways at the White House. Its very first publication occurred at the first presentation of the opening song happened at a spoken word event in the White House in 2009, early in the Obama presidency, right when In the Heights was raging on Broadway, so it was a very different moment. And then of course, over the years, it became conservatives like making fun of Hamilton as Obama's favorite musical. And so I think what it does is it deploys, it is, one of the things that's really important to acknowledge is it is one of the most celebrated and acclaimed works of art in any media in the 21st century, and it also happens to be written by a Latino. And so even though it's not got any, like we could argue, and folks do, over whether it's a Latino work, I think the reason I say it is a Latino work is it meets my 3 tests for Latino drama, which is typically you're dealing with Latino drama if it's A, written by a Latino, B, sort of engaging with some kind of transformation, either reform or community, doing adventurous exploration. So Luis Valdez, like sort of trying to sort of say something different about what we need to think about now. And then also Maria Irene Fornes, trying to think about form, but also acknowledging that Latinos are valued members of the audience. And Hamilton, even though it does, like In the Heights, is all about Latinos on stage and off. Hamilton is barely, but there's key moments which are really, like the most famous one is Immigrants Would Get the Job Done, right?
Yeah.
This moment that has become this sort of call out saying, Latinos, I see you here. And it's an acknowledgement. But the key thing about why Hamilton is an important example of Latino dramaturgy is it's premised in code switching. It's speaking 2 musical languages fluently. It's speaking mid-20th century musical theater. It speaks it fluently. It's speaking late 90s, early 2000s hip hop fluently. It speaks both of those musical idioms in a way that if you are fluent in either of them, you hear the language you know spoken very well, which in some ways helps you tune your ear to a language you might not know as well. And the fact that Hamilton is anchored in the creative practice of code switching is to me an example of rehearsing in some ways something that Latino playwrights get a lot of grief for, is when they put Spanish on stage, they're yelled at for alienating their audiences. But what they've done, what Latino playwrights have really found this way of sort of inhabiting that. Asian American playwrights right now are in this boom where they can put, there's all kinds of theatrical ways where they can put Korean or Vietnamese on stage, and critics are not saying, what are you doing alienating me? But they're sort of rehearsing it, and I think this is the stealth way of how Latinos and theater makers really understand the power of code switching, speaking two truths at the same time. And what we see in the Heights is the beginning of that practice, because in the Heights, Lin-Manuel Miranda is speaking musical theater very fluently. He's also speaking 20th century popular Latin music very fluently too. So if you know either, you realize like, oh, okay, I can trust you and I'll dance with you along the rhythms I understand. And along the way, I'll follow some other rhythms too. In Hamilton, he takes that in a different direction, while also offering a different vision of what American political power can be like. The mistake people make with Hamilton, and this is a mistake that people have often made, is looking for it to be a resistant work of progressive critique. Lin-Manuel Miranda is emphatically a mainstream cultural producer. He is working in conservative genres, in resource, like he's working for Broadway and Disney. These are not spaces for critique. So in some ways, and his narratives are really guided by a neoliberal sort of pull yourself by the bootstraps, sort of meritocratic vision of opportunity that is very easy to understand its limitations in our contemporary world. So if we look to Miranda as being a figure for critique and progressive transformation, I don't know if we're going to get it. What we have in Miranda is somebody who sees the priority of speaking bilingually in terms of form as well as content, and also somebody who has made an emphatic commitment in every work he's done to make sure that there are roles, good roles, quality roles available for people of color. So in some ways he might not be meeting some of our channels of critique, but he is using his access to create opportunities for others. And I think that we need, and in some ways we need not one, we need many. And if we have a Miranda, we might have others who can do other things. Like if he's leading that force, like that's great. But, and I do think that we will be reckoning with the implications of Hamilton for a good while. I think especially as Hamilton permeates the bloodstream, we start seeing it in high schools and colleges and swing choirs and those kind of things, it's going to continue to confront people's expectations about what work is supposed to be doing and what the place is of race and who can speak what musical rhythms, idioms. But I think Hamilton is, I think we have yet to see what it means in the new political regime. I think it was an emblematic work of the aspirational potentiality embodied by, with all of its limitations, embodied by the Obama era, where the presidency could look different. American history could look different. There could be a sense of presence and participation in the story of the Founding Fathers in a way that had been empowered by the fact that the president of this country for 8 years had been a person who nobody ever thought could be a president of this country, you know? And so it's that potential. In this contemporary moment, it'll be interesting to see what we learn about Hamilton as we see it confronting with some of the different visions for what America is and what is great about America. To my knowledge, the current president has not seen Hamilton. He has called it overrated. So, which seems to be emerging as a particular badge of honor among certain cultural classes, among people who make work in this moment. You know, if he calls you overrated, then then it means that you're doing something. You know, you can decide whether it's right or wrong, but it does seem like Meryl Streep and Hamilton are overrated. Okay, this is building a category already. You know, so and I do think that as Hamilton continues to move through different communities, what it means in terms of its racial registers will be revealed too. But what I will say is it is confronting theater practice in all kinds of important ways. It's creating incredible opportunities. I have every expectation it will launch all kinds of careers. And as a historian, those are transformative works. And I think it's going to have a huge impact for multiracial performers. because it doesn't rely on a binary of cultural authenticity for casting. It does rely upon an emergent binary of white on white, but you don't have to be Latino enough, or Black enough, or Asian enough to get a role in Hamilton. You just have to be a person of color. And so I think there's a real potential for those performers with those skill sets to be able to have their profile amplified in ways that can, hopefully they'll be able to leverage to other opportunities in other segments of the entertainment economy. So, perhaps, one last question, I guess? Or, yeah. Okay,
Sure,
here. Yeah.
if you have time. I was just curious, in your study and inquiry of performance and performers, what you learned about audiences and community.
One of the things when I undertook the study, I undertook it to take seriously the mainstream as opposed to the grassroots, right? Because so much of Latino performance studies had oriented itself to works by, for, about emerging from the community. And I felt that that had led to a kind of casual dismissal of the mainstream as being a space of negativity or of oppression. What I've come to appreciate more fully as the years have gone along in terms of what I've learned about community is how dynamic the interplay between the mainstream and the grassroots always is, you know. And what I think is there continues to be a very there's an intentionality about Latino audiences where they select the works that they're going to select, but often in defiance of marketing categories. And so it's, I think that Latino audiences prize, like, I don't know in terms of the contemporary moment, but I think when you see, Latinos are always pointed to as being the hugest, they keep the American film industry going. And, you know, they are the biggest ticket buyers as a body. They buy retail tickets, they buy expensive weekend tickets, it's a family outing. So the Latinos spend disproportionate amount of dollars on seeing movies in the theater. Hollywood is aware of this. It has yet to find a way to communicate and connect with this, because it tends to be stuck in a notion that Latinos only want to see Latinos, or they're a niche audience, they want to only, you know, so there's, like every time we see a new Latino network come along, it doesn't really last, you know, it's still a little bit unclear, but I do think that there is an interesting balance between being valued as an audience member and being a participant as an audience member. And so part of what I'm seeing, what I feel I've learned about community is when Latinos feel like they're being acknowledged with respect, they can be very loyal. So they will be loyal to bands, to teams, to performers, and often non-Latino performers, because they feel, so there is something interesting about the consumption and inclusion. I do think, I don't know if it's a good answer to your question about community, because I think I work very much in the mainstream, and I work very much in the arts, in the creative community, but in terms of the audience, I'm mostly defending how the audience is misrepresented and how audiences take the blame for laziness and bad habits on the part of producers, because I think the audience has a wisdom that is a collective and is therefore hard to break down you know. So I don't know if I have much more to say other than Latino audiences are amazing, and they're incredibly dedicated, and they are not understood, I don't think, by anybody.
I'm just curious, let's say a specific example. Do you think the success of Rogue One in the United States, it would have been a difference if they had casted someone, a non-Latino, in the role that Diego plays? Would it have had any effect, or would it just have been this similar, you know, box office?
Well, I think what we see with both Oscar Isaac and Diego Luna being incorporated into the Star Wars franchise is we begin to see how you can have a Latino who speaks with an accent and a Latino who many people might not know as Latino, both be hailed by the Latino audience as being, we're glad you're there, dude. You know, there's a kind of way that I think one of the things in terms of causality, and this goes back to Hamilton, is, I think, Diego Luna's success and the testimonies that we can derive, the fact that Rogue One did so well, just as the fact that Hidden Figures did so well, just the fact that Hamilton has done so well, and has done so well with audiences beyond the ethnic groups that are hailed by it. Those are the reference points that I think that we need to celebrate as being sort of, it wasn't, I often use the word deal breaker. A movie about space and math with 3 black women as the stars was not a deal breaker for American audiences multiple weeks. That put pressure on the other box office blockbuster, which had a Latino man who wasn't tall, who spoke with an accent in a protagonist role. Neither of those were deal breakers for American audiences. So next time, producer people, you say, I don't know if audiences will accept a movie with 3 black women as protagonists when it's about, they liked Hidden Figures. I don't know if audiences will accept a hero who is not all American, Diego Luna. You know, I don't know if audiences will accept if you just make a decision between those genres. Hamilton. This is where artistic leadership manifests, and artistic leadership, like, I don't know if audiences will accept a show in which a character speaks only Spanish and you have to follow subtitles. I mean, Jane the Virgin hasn't been breaking ratings numbers, but it's been doing just fine. You know, we've got precedent, and it's not that one precedent will solve the problem, but part of what we have is the capacity to say, look, don't tell us it can't be done. You know, and that's where I think that this, that the audiences are showing up that are both Latino and non-Latino for all of these, because that's, I think, the part that has often, whether it's the electorate or Broadway ticket sales, producers are ready to blame Latinos. Pundits are ready to blame Latinos for not showing up the way they were expected to show up. But when we actually pay attention to how Latinos show up and who they show up adjacent to, we actually see much more. But there's this idea to try to make Latinos, and everybody who's Latino knows that, like, Latinos are lots of things. And that's why it's important to think of, like, the Latino presence in a theater adjacent to the presences of others, and how Latino audiences will show up for cartoons, they'll show up animated features, they'll show up for all kinds of things. And yet, when we see the emotional response that happened in testimonies that circulated the weekend that Rogue opened, and, you know, just this way of, like, seeing a figure like that on screen, how transformative it can be. Like, this is to say, like, okay, this was your standard issue sci-fi blockbuster. You're going to make a bunch of money anyway. While you're making a bunch of money, why not have a couple black ladies in it? You know, it's like, try to do both. You know, because Hollywood is, and other things, there's this sort of, because popular performance is often so resource intensive at the outset, that there's a reluctance to invest, because we don't know if we can get the return. That encourages a reticence, and that reticence on producers and decision makers is often blamed on the reluctance of the audience. And so part of what I often say is, if the audience starts taking the blame in a hypothetical sense, gotta find a way to derail that conversation. And the best way to derail it is with precedent. It's pulling up other precedent. And thankfully, in this century, there's all kinds of precedent that are complex and defining. And because what we have often had is the thing of, like the All-American Girl phenomenon, of, like, Margaret Cho's Shame, that, like, okay, we had an Asian American sitcom on TV and it bombed, and there's not going to be another one for 20 years, and of her feeling the responsibility for that failure. What we as arts advocates and as historians and as critics need to be very resistant to how we participate in that burden of representation that lands on the shoulders of culture makers. And whenever we see it doing so out of habit, saying audiences won't accept, or is this enough, is this blank enough, to use what access we have as advocates to redirect that conversation, saying there's precedent here, it doesn't have to be that way. You know, to learn from the leadership that is provided by the folks who are able to take their window of opportunity and make something awesome that ends up having a measure of success that is legible to folks outside of the community. And we were fortunate in every era to have examples of that. And so what we just need to do is be more attentive to what those examples are. And especially sort of saying, if we don't like Eastless High, or if we don't like One Day at a Time, or if we don't like Jane the Virgin, or if we don't like Hamilton, that's fine. suck it up in alliance and see what's awesome and what they did well and why they did what they did. We can critique the limitations of Hamilton's neoliberal presumptions and all this kind of thing. But we can also say this is a major thing work by a Latino, and what he's doing is he's doing code switching. He's prioritizing the experiences of people of color as workers in the industry. He's creating these opportunities. That's awesome. And so my stance is always to understand ourselves as critics, as historians, as makers, but also figuring out what our role as advocates are, because we're often, when we're advocating for our own work, writing grant applications or making decisions about who gets what, we're taking that role and we often haven't thought through our ethical stance in relationship to it. And so part of, I think, what's important about when you're advocating for more and better opportunities, more and better representations, is what are the ethical guidelines for your own advocacy? And if you don't know them, it's worth figuring out, because we're called upon, those of us in buildings like this, we're called upon to be advocates a lot, and we haven't always rehearsed ourselves on what we believe in arts advocacy. And so a glib aside about, oh, that wasn't so great, can be heard as us being an advocate in a negative way. So it's about being intentional about how we talk about the future of the work we care about. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, and appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit. Thanks for your attention. I know it was, yeah, so, okay.
Thank you.